lab, she barely glanced at the young men blending and separating compounds. Lynne paid strict attention to her own measurements. She harbored diffuse fears of blowing the building up. "Why are you here?" the men asked Lynne. It could have been intended as a compliment for a pretty woman under artificial lab lights, but the words had a hectoring edginess. For Lynne, declaring a major was a promise, and she did not break her promises. She spent 4 years in class and in the lab, and acquired 2 assistantships to keep herself afloat financially, including one working with soil samples for a palynology professor. Lynne was good at extracting 100-year-old pollen from soil. It impressed her that pollen could not be destroyed and would always provide a map of the past. But beneath her commitment to her biology major, her gratitude to her parents, and her determination in the face of the subtle intimidation in the labs, Lynne had doubts. Sometimes she wondered what she was doing, what she was preparing for, especially as she learned about the world outside of upstate New York. In Baldwinsville, around the dinner table on Sundays, when her parents closed the general store they owned to eat together as a family, international politics never came up. But at the coffee shops and diners in Oswego, Lynne's peers debated government policy ardently. Combat in Vietnam escalated throughout Lynne's undergraduate years, and Lynne listened to her college boyfriend and his friends discussing the war. The first few times they challenged the decisions President Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara were making in Washington, she felt uneasy. Who were they to question figures of authority, she asked. They were male college seniors in the United States, they answered. Their draft numbers and the end of their deferment upon graduation entitled them to question the government. Around the country and the world, in West Berlin, Sweden, Mexico City, students had begun to protest a war that, Lynne learned, had never been declared a war by Congress. Now she realized that covert American intervention in the region went back decades, to the Second World War and the decolonization that followed, separating Vietnam into North and South. Communism ruled in the USSR-allied North. A nominally democratic regime ruled in the South. American interest in the region centered on natural resources, Vietnam's tin, tungsten, and rubber, and the fear of what President Eisenhower had called a decade earlier the falling domino principle. Between school and jobs, Lynne had little time to read newspapers. But she listened as her boyfriend honed his arguments, incorporating information gleaned from local and national newspapers and his political science coursework. He and his friends drained cup after stained coffee cup during heated debate. 2 perspectives on the American troops that flooded into South Vietnam emerged. From one angle, American aid to the democratic half of a split Vietnam represented the nation's commitment to helping the residents of a small, poor country resist a communist insurgency. From another, deteriorating conditions in the South, anti-democratic elections, political arrests that kept prisons continually stuffed, a hampered press, corruption of the military and government, and deepening poverty, demonstrated the essentially imperialist nature of growing American intervention. As one semester led to the next, Lynne's reluctance to second-guess national policy faded and grew into a conviction that she could do more in the real world than in a lab. In her scant free time, she glanced at the front pages of newspapers and magazines and saw names of countries she had never thought about before. There's a whole world out there, she thought, and I need to get involved. As she walked across the stage at graduation, her parents clapping proudly in the audience, Lynne felt a sinking sensation over the choices that had narrowed her life. She was qualified to work as a research assistant or a science teacher, or, as many of her peers had done already, she could marry. Lynne was still awed by the intricacies of the natural world, but felt drained by the isolation and intimidation of the lab. She had the extroversion for teaching, but she had already spent much of her life in classrooms. Marriage eventually, but certainly not now. Graduation was the worst day of her life. But a professor had encouraged Lynne to sign up for a college-sponsored painting course in Rome that summer, and she had taken out a small loan to pay for what her savings did not cover. A break from science coursework might be refreshing for her, the professor had said.